The stench of turned earth and stagnant water hangs heavy in the pre-dawn darkness of October 16, 1781. You are standing in a muddy trench just a few hundred yards from the British defenses at Yorktown, barely able to keep your eyes open. Before you lies a sprawling maze of earthworks, and the absolute silence is more terrifying than the roar of artillery. Suddenly, shadows detach themselves from the mist, and the glint of cold steel breaks the night. You have exactly 3 seconds to raise your musket before a wall of British bayonets crashes into your position. How do you hold the line when your body has completely shut down? Welcome to the desperate, bloody trench fight that sealed the fate of the American Revolution. Report for duty with a like and subscribe for next week's grand assault. By mid-October, the Siege of Yorktown was strangling the British Army. The British Earl was trapped against the York River, his escape routes severed by the French fleet and his fortifications pulverized by constant Allied bombardment. The Virginian commander and the French marshal were systematically dismantling the British defenses through a brutal engineering process known as siege parallels. These were massive, zigzagging trenches dug into the Virginia soil under the constant, terrifying arc of British mortar fire. But this mechanical strangulation required an agonizing human cost. The men digging and guarding these trenches were utterly exhausted. For weeks, Allied soldiers had worked through the night, wielding shovels and pickaxes in miserable conditions. They were forced to construct gabions, which were massive wicker baskets filled with heavy earth, and stack bundles of sticks called fascines to reinforce the collapsing trench walls. Sleep was a luxury none could afford. Disease, malnutrition, and the sheer physical toll of moving tons of wet earth had hollowed out the infantry. The men were rotated in shifts, but the constant alert status shattered their nervous systems. By the night of October 15th, the Allied forces had completed their second parallel, bringing their devastating heavy siege artillery dangerously close to the British lines. These massive cannons were the key to absolute victory. If they opened fire from this new point-blank range, the remaining British redoubts would be turned to dust within hours. The British commander knew that passive defense was now a death sentence. He needed a miracle, or at the very least, a tactical disruption to buy his army time to cross the river and escape. He authorized a desperate, highly aggressive night sortie. He ordered the vanguard leader to take a detachment of 350 elite infantrymen, slip across the shattered terrain, and infiltrate the Allied trenches. Their mission was not to conquer the trenches, but to cripple the Allied artillery. They were ordered to spike the massive French and American siege guns before the batteries could become fully operational. A standard heavy siege gun of the era possessed a massive bronze or iron barrel, leaving only one distinct vulnerability. The ignition point was the touch hole, a narrow vent drilled directly into the breech. To spike it meant driving a hardened steel rat-tail file directly into this vent. The saboteur would then violently strike the file sideways with a heavy hammer. The brittle steel would snap flush with the exterior of the barrel. This effectively plugged the ignition channel with a metal harder than the cannon itself, neutralizing the weapon instantly. Without a clear touch hole, the cannons could not be fired, and drilling out the steel would take days the Allies did not have. At 3 a.m. on October 16th, the British assault force moved out. They advanced in total silence, their muskets unloaded to prevent an accidental discharge from ruining the element of surprise. They relied entirely on the bayonet. The terrain between the lines was a shattered wasteland of artillery craters, splintered timber, and discarded equipment. The vanguard leader divided his force into two columns, targeting two unfinished Allied batteries where the French and American lines met. The darkness provided perfect cover, but the British also employed calculated psychological deception. As they approached the first line of Allied sentries, a guard called out into the dark, demanding the password. A British officer, perfectly mimicking a colonial accent, shouted back that they were an American detachment. The hesitation lasted only a second. But in night warfare, a second is a lifetime. The British vanguard surged forward, vaulting over the earthen parapets and crashing down into the trenches. The killing zone opened. The Allied sentries were overwhelmed in an instant. The sleeping trench guards awoke to the terrifying sound of snapping wood and the chaotic screams of close-quarters combat. In the specific sector targeted by the British, only about 100 French and American soldiers were immediately awake and in a position to fight. They were cold, severely disoriented, and heavily outnumbered by elite assault troops who already possessed the momentum of the charge. The plan was one mistake away from collapse. Trench warfare in the late 18th century was governed by brutal physical mechanics. A siege trench is a highly confined space, usually no more than a few feet wide, flanked by towering walls of loose dirt and wooden supports. When 350 attacking infantrymen pour into this narrow channel, the sheer density of human bodies dictates the mechanics of survival. Muskets were nearly 6 feet long when equipped with their lethal 17-inch triangular bayonets. In an open field, this length provided necessary reach. Inside a dark, muddy trench, it became an unwieldy lever. Swinging a weapon with any lateral force was physically impossible. Men had to thrust straight forward, driving the steel blades through thick wool uniforms, heavy leather belts, and bone. The 100 exhausted defenders found themselves pressed backward into the slick mud. They could not form a traditional linear firing line. Instead, they fought in desperate, isolated clusters against a surging tide of British infantry. The British vanguard pushed relentlessly toward the siege batteries. Momentum heavily favored the attackers. The vanguard leader's men reached the first unfinished battery, a massive dirt emplacement holding vital heavy guns. British pioneers immediately went to work in the pitch black. They located the brass touch holes entirely by feel. They hammered their rat-tail files deep into the narrow vents. Steel struck brass. The spikes snapped off. Four massive cannons were instantly disabled. Then the saboteurs rushed to the next battery, spiking 2 more guns before the Allied defenders could effectively rally. The high trench walls compressed the fighting into an agonizing crush of bodies. Men slipped on the wet earth, falling beneath the heavy boots of the advancing columns. The weight of the British kinetic push was slowly buckling the thin, fragmented line of trench guards. The defenders were operating on pure adrenaline, their depleted bodies burning through the absolute last reserves of physical energy. Logistics vanished completely in the dark. There was no resupply of ammunition and no reinforced rear echelon stepping up to relieve the pressure. It was simply the cold steel in their hands and the sucking mud beneath their boots. The British infantry utilized the element of shock perfectly. They maintained a tight, aggressive formation, using their concentrated mass to physically displace the smaller Allied groups. Every time an Allied soldier fell, the British stepped over him, claiming another yard of the critical earthwork. But the confined geography of the parallel also began to work against the attackers. The 350 British men could not fan out or exploit their numerical superiority. They were violently bottlenecked by the walls of the redoubt, meaning only the men at the very front of the column could actually engage the enemy. This physical limitation gave the exhausted defenders a fragile window to stabilize the line. The French trench guards, primarily veterans from the Agenais and Soissonnais regiments, anchored their heavy boots into the trench walls. They leveled their bayonets simultaneously, creating a bristling, static wall of steel that finally absorbed the kinetic shock of the British advance. The forward momentum stalled against the resistance. In your opinion, was this localized night attack a brilliant tactical gamble or a suicidal waste of elite troops? Silence. Then the counterattack began. The initial shock of the ambush had worn off, and the localized noise of the struggle had finally roused the Allied reserves from the surrounding dugouts. The French aristocrat, commanding that specific sector, recognized the existential threat to the siege artillery. If the vanguard leader managed to spike the remaining guns and hold the trench until morning, the siege could be delayed by several critical weeks. The entire campaign would be jeopardized by the rapidly approaching winter and the looming threat of British naval reinforcements. This could still fail. The French commander did not wait for the British to consolidate their newly captured positions. He rallied a nearby detachment of French infantry and ordered an immediate, ruthless countercharge straight down the parallel. He forbade his men from loading their weapons, knowing that a musket flash in the dark would result in devastating friendly fire. They would rely exclusively on the bayonet to retake the battery. The physical dynamics of the trench now violently reversed. The British, having expended their initial burst of energy and having lost their rigid formation while rushing to spike the guns, were suddenly caught entirely off balance. The French hit them with a disciplined, concentrated mass of infantry. The collision of the two opposing forces cracked through the night air. The French used the collective weight of their dense formation to physically push the British backward into the mud. Reach, leverage, and sheer mass displacement dictated the immediate outcome. The vanguard leader's men quickly realized that the element of surprise was completely gone, and that heavier Allied reinforcements were pouring into the communication trenches. They broke off the close quarters engagement to avoid total encirclement. The resulting retreat was as chaotic as the initial assault. British soldiers scrambled desperately up the steep earthen parapets, fatally exposing their silhouettes against the night skyline. Allied infantry unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire into the retreating figures. The lead balls tore through the retreating columns, leaving casualties draped heavily over the defensive earthworks. The vanguard leader successfully extracted the bulk of his command back to the British lines, but the brutal sortie had ultimately failed in its primary strategic objective. The British had managed to spike 6 artillery pieces during their desperate infiltration of the trench network. But they had fundamentally underestimated the sophisticated engineering capability of the Allied army. The spikes used by the British pioneers were hastily driven in the dark under extreme duress. They were not properly secured or deeply hardened to the necessary degree. Within hours, French artillerists and mechanics were at work inside the battered redoubts. Using specialized tools, they simply punched the temporary spikes straight through into the barrels, or carefully drilled them out of the brass. By sunrise, all 6 of the previously disabled cannons were fully operational and ready to fire. The ultimate sacrifice of the trench guards, who had held the line and absorbed the full kinetic impact of the British assault, had contained the tactical damage. Those 100 exhausted men had bought the engineers the precious, bleeding time they desperately needed. The psychological effect on the British Earl was devastating. His absolute best troops had executed a near-perfect night infiltration, achieved their immediate tactical goal, and it had amounted to nothing. The final operational hope of the British Army had been neutralized by the physical resilience of a few depleted trench guards and the brutal efficiency of French siege engineers. The following morning, the Allied Grand Battery opened a massive, unrelenting bombardment from the newly secured second parallel. The remaining British defenses were systematically pounded into dust under a storm of heavy iron. On October 17, 1781, a single British drummer boy mounted the shattered parapet and beaked the formal signal for a parley. The Siege of Yorktown was effectively over. The tactical lesson of the trenches remained starkly clear for future generations. Fortifications, engineering, and heavy artillery will always win sieges, but they are entirely dependent on the desperate, exhausted infantrymen who bleed to protect them in the dark. What battle should we analyze in the next episode?